Well, hello, Steve. Here we are a week away from the election, less than a week away. And the polling numbers for the Conservatives and the Liberals are getting a little tighter in your latest Leger poll.
They are. So our weekly poll that we've done since the beginning of the campaign is no different this week, other than we've got some tightening of the results. We've got the Liberal Party holding steady at 43%, and the Conservatives edging up another point to 39. So a 4-point race. And just a couple weeks back, we were talking about 7 or 8 points. So definitely tightening of the numbers and a little bit of a resurgence, if you will, of Conservatives late in the game. But I'm not sure it's going to be enough to make a difference. We're still possibly in majority territory. If we see another point by this time, by the day before Election Day, we might call something different. But right now, it looks like the Liberal lead is still not formidable, but it's still enough to have a decisive election outcome.
And the NDP is still lagging way behind.
It really is. They've just done nothing but go down in the polls, not just even during the election campaign. We saw the start of that as we saw the rise of the Conservative Party over time, over the past year, especially here in British Columbia. And nationally, we've seen their numbers deteriorate. So they used to be, in the 20 percentile. And now we've got our latest read of 8% nationwide, which is, looking almost at a decimation of the party. We could end up with just a handful of seats in some of those selective ridings, especially in BC, that have been NDP forever and ever.
So what is changing? Is there a reason why the Liberals have stalled and the Conservatives are inching slowly upward, or is this really the Liberals are sort of maxed out because they're doing very well, obviously?
They have been doing really well. If there's any, I wouldn't say a catalyst, but there was the leadership debate last week, and we did see some pretty solid viewing numbers. We saw at least 44% of Canadians that saw some version of the debate, whether they watched the whole thing or part of the thing. So that's a pretty high number in this day and age. And when you look at the overall, who did they pick as the winner? It was slightly favoring Poilievre at 39% to Carney at 38%. Now, in all the other measures we've talked about through this campaign, who would make the best prime minister? Who do they think is going to win the election? We've seen Carney in the lead. This is a moment where decisively Poilievre did better, perhaps even than what he was expected to do.
Remind people, we're talking about 43 to 39. It's only a 4-point lead, margin of error around 2.5%. But that's still enough, given the way the vote breaks down across the country, to give the Liberals a majority.
Yeah, and that's the important thing. And we always complain about this in British Columbia, that by the time we turn on our television sets, when the results are released, that is the election's already determined. And that's because the time zones and Ontario and Quebec, the strength of those two. So we've got Carney firmly in front in Ontario, 48 to 41. And Quebec as well, 42 to 22. So those are numbers in and of itself good enough to almost decisively say it's over after those results are in. We do have, we pointed out these interesting results in British Columbia where it's neck and neck. We're down to now a 2-point lead with Carney in British Columbia over at 43% compared to 41% for Poilievre. So that's also tightened up, just like we've seen federally. We've got Alberta, which has always leaned conservative by quite a margin at 59 to 27. So there will be still some interesting things happening in the West. What will probably be the side story is how many seats can the NDP actually hang on to, and that won't be determined until we count the BC votes.
Okay. And then one question you've been asking is how firm people's votes are. Is this their final choice? Have you seen any movement there?
There has been a drop, and it still leaves some room, though. We have the 51% saying their choice is final and 36% saying they might change their mind. It seems like a big number. It is kind of a big number, but we saw numbers last week that was more around 60%. So tightening of that, and there's no longer this major difference between Liberal voters and Conservative voters, which is, for the first time, because in previous polls, we've shown that the Conservative voters are way more aligned and entrenched to their vote choice, and Liberals a little softer, and not so much in the final week of the campaign.
Well, and we know 7 million people voted in the advanced polls, so that's already in the books. So a bit of an uphill climb still for the Conservatives.
Yeah, and that tends to favor Liberal voters. When we look at the poll results and look at the percentage who have already voted, it tends to be more Liberals are voting earlier, but it doesn't really have any bearing on the election outcome. We always look to those numbers as a trend, but we've seen in years past, it's just simply the convenience factor. Working folks with kids and busy activities tend to show up, and those who are older with more time in their hands, retirees, tend to not. And so, it really doesn't matter who's showing up first or last. What matters is the final ballot.
And when you ask people about top issues, not surprisingly, tariffs and Trump are still, far and away the most important issue for people.
And that is what has really hurt the Conservatives. If that number was any different, if those numbers had dropped, we would have seen perhaps a different election outcome. So we ask Canadians, what's the top issue influencing vote choice? 35% say it's tariffs, Trump, U.S. aggression. And then we have all of our standard normal pain points of Canadians: inflation, healthcare, taxes, housing accessibility. All of those are far below the number one issue. And when you break that down on party lines, the results are really apparent. So you look at Liberal voters, and we have 58% that are saying the number one issue is tariffs, Trump, and it's only 20% with Conservative voters. The same as we've polled in previous weeks, but it's worth pointing out again to your listeners and readers.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting. And I'm surprised that housing is rated so lowly, because, when we just went through a provincial election and housing was a big issue for people.
It really is. It's kind of shocking that it just fell off the map, and that hurt Poilievre. He's been talking about housing. Besides axe the tax, housing was his number one agenda item. When that moved to fourth place, he really had a hard time, I think, filling the void of that gap.
And healthcare, that was certainly an issue that anyone who watched the English language debate, you could see Jagmeet Singh going heavily on healthcare and accusing his opponents of wanting to privatize healthcare, and the NDP being the only party that would save it. And you can see in the numbers here, at least in BC, that's at 27%. So it's the second most important issue for people here.
It is a big issue. It's risen to its highest point in many, many years. I think Singh maybe is a little bit late to the game on that, because both the party leaders on the other sides are saying we're not going to tinker with that. The healthcare was not really a heavy part of the election platform for the Liberals or the Conservatives. So it really doesn't factor in when the parties are saying the same things.
Well, you'll be doing another poll as we get closer to election day. What are you watching for from the leaders in the final week?
Really, not so much from the leaders as what does Trump do in the next week. He can, I wouldn't say derail it at this point in time, but if there's a major breakthrough in the trade disputes and the tariffs, if he comes out with an announcement that's in favor of Canada, that could help the Conservatives. If he keeps his hard line and keeps a hard stance on anything he has to say about Canada, that's going to benefit Carney. So he's really the major factor in any last-minute changes. And I guess the other part, as you've already referred to, is the solidification of the vote. Is there any movement in that? And in an election where there's a 4-point spread, you can get some funny things happening in the final few days of the campaign as people really finally make up their minds. And then the third, probably the most important factor, is the turnout rate. And that's, we've talked about this a little bit before. If you're in the 18 to 34-year-old group, your likelihood of showing up at the polling station on election day is about 50%. If you're 75 or 65 to 75 retiree, you are 75% likely to show up at the polling station. So who shows up is a final determinant in how the parties do. The interesting thing, though, is in this election, it seems like the young people in the country are leaning more conservative than they ever have. And if youth show up in greater numbers than what they typically have shown up in, that could be another surprise on election day.
Wow, that would be a surprise. We hear more and more, and I think this comes up different elections, different levels over the year, the idea of strategic voting, particularly New Democrats who are voting for Liberals to keep the Conservatives out. Does that show up in the polling over the last month?
It does. Last week's poll did exactly that. It actually showed that 17% of Liberal voters are voting specifically for the Conservatives to not get in power. And I haven't seen numbers like that for years. I just don't remember the last time it's been that. Usually it's the support of the party and the party policies that they're behind, but to have 17% of voters saying specifically they're doing it just to avoid a Conservative victory is really could be the one factor that is the end story in this entire election.
It also strikes me as it's been a very leader-focused election. We haven't heard much from the local candidates in terms of local issues and things that they were going to do for their communities. The odd thing here or there, but all the parties seem intent on keeping the spotlight on their leaders.
It really is. It's unlike most elections that we've ever covered. You're right. They've almost disappeared, and it's a complete contrast in essence to the provincial election that we just recently had, where the leader up until the last month of the campaign was really absent, and people were voting for the party and voting for their candidates in British Columbia. So it is the emphasis has for sure been on the leaders in this because they are all thinking in the back of their minds, who is best to deal with the chaos that Trump has thrown at Canada? And that's, the singular issue that's keeping people awake at night.
All right. Well, thank you, Steve. You've got a few more sleepless nights before the election yourself. Yes. Look forward to talking to you at least one more time before Election Day.
We'll look forward to that. Yes, it's the litmus test for pollsters, isn't it? And we always sit with bated breath wondering how accurate our polls are going to be. We've had a pretty good track record. We'll cross our fingers that we can keep that going. So yes, we'll talk soon.